Maya Johnson stood outside the big wooden doors of Lincoln Middle School, her heart beating fast like a drum. She looked at the tall brick building with its many windows and felt butterflies dancing in her stomach. The morning sun was shining, bright, but Maya felt cold inside. This was her first day at a new school and she didn't know anyone here. She walked slowly through the front doors, holding her new schedule tight in her hand. The paper was already getting wrinkled because her palms were sweaty. The hallways were full of students talking and laughing with their friends. Maya wished she had friends to talk to, but she was all alone. Maya's family had moved to the small town of Millbrook just 2 weeks ago. Her father got a new job as the principal of this very school, but Maya didn't want anyone to know that yet. She wanted to make friends the normal way, without people treating her special because of her dad's job. She hoped the other kids would like her for who she was, not because her father was the boss. The hallway was noisy and busy. Students were opening their lockers, and teachers were walking around with coffee cups in their hands. Maya looked at her schedule again. She needed to find room 204 for her first class, which was English. She walked down one hallway, then another, looking at the numbers on the doors. Finally, she found it. Room 204 had a sign that said, "Mrs. Henderson, English?" Maya took a deep breath and knocked softly on the door. She could hear the teacher talking inside and she didn't want to interrupt, but she had to go in. "Come in," called a voice from inside the room. Maya opened the door and stepped into the classroom. All the students turned to look at her, and she felt her face getting warm. Mrs. Henderson was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back tight. She wore glasses and had a serious look on her face that made Maya feel nervous. Mrs. Henderson was standing at the front of the class with some papers in her hand. She looked at Maya like she was not happy to see her. Maya walked up to the teacher's desk and handed her the enrollment papers that the office had given her. Mrs. Henderson took the papers but barely looked at them. She didn't smile at Maya or say welcome to the class. Instead, she just pointed to an empty desk in the back corner of the room. "You can sit there," Mrs. Henderson said in a cold voice. Maya felt disappointed. She had hoped the teacher would introduce her to the class and maybe help her feel welcome. But Mrs. Henderson just went back to talking about the lesson like Maya wasn't even there. Maya walked to the empty desk in the back corner. Some of the other students smiled at her and seemed friendly, but others just stared at her with curious looks. She sat down and took out her notebook, trying to listen to what Mrs. Henderson was saying. The teacher was talking about poetry and asking the class questions about different poems. Maya loved reading and was good at English, so she knew the answers to many of the questions. She raised her hand when Mrs. Henderson asked about metaphors in a poem. But something strange happened. Mrs. Henderson looked right at Maya's raised hand but didn't call on her. Instead, she called on a boy named Jake who was sitting in the front row. Maya thought maybe the teacher didn't see her hand, so she kept it up. But Mrs. Henderson kept ignoring her. This happened several times during the class. Maya would raise her hand to answer a question, but Mrs. Henderson would always call on someone else. Maya started to feel confused and a little hurt. Maybe the teacher wanted to give other students a chance first since it was Maya's first day. After about 20 minutes, Mrs. Henderson was talking about a poem by Langston Hughes. Maya had read this poem before and really understood it well. When the teacher asked what the poem meant, Maya couldn't help herself. She spoke up without raising her hand first. "I think the poem is about hope and dreams," Maya said. "The author is saying that even when life is hard, we should never give up on our dreams because they keep us going." Some of the other students nodded and looked impressed. A girl named Jessica who sat near Maya smiled and whispered, "That's really good." But Mrs. Henderson did not look happy. She frowned and waved her hand like she was brushing away Maya's words. "That's an interesting perspective," Mrs. Henderson said, but her voice sounded like she didn't think it was interesting at all. "But let's hear from someone who might understand the traditional interpretation better." She turned to a white boy named Connor, who had been struggling with the questions all class. "Connor, what do you think the poem means?" Connor looked confused and said something about the poem being about weather. His answer didn't make much sense, but Mrs. Henderson nodded like it was much better than Maya's answer. Maya felt her stomach drop. She knew her answer was good, and she could tell that other students thought so too. But the teacher acted like Connor's wrong answer was better than her right one. It didn't make any sense. The bell rang, and it was time to go to the next class. Maya packed up her books, feeling sad and confused. As she was walking toward the door, she heard Mrs. Henderson talking to another teacher who had come into the room. "They're really lowering the standards these days with the students they're accepting," Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that wasn't very quiet. Maya felt her face get hot. She was pretty sure Mrs. Henderson was talking about her. But why? Maya was a good student. She had always gotten good grades at her old school. She loved to read and write, and she worked hard on all her assignments. Maya walked out of the classroom feeling upset. She told herself that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was having a bad day, or maybe she was always tough on new students. Maya decided to give it more time and see if things got better. But as she walked to her next class, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The way Mrs. Henderson looked at her, the way she ignored her raised hand, and the comment about lowering standards. It all made Maya feel unwelcome and different. Maya didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. Mrs. Henderson had already decided that she didn't like Maya, and it had nothing to do with Maya's abilities or behavior. It had everything to do with the color of Maya's skin, and it was going to get much worse before it got better. For now, Maya walked down the hallway, hoping that tomorrow would be a better day, not knowing that her father, the principal of the very school where she was being treated unfairly, was working just a few floors above her head. 3 weeks had passed since Maya's first day at Lincoln Middle School, and things were not getting better. In fact, they were getting much worse. Every morning when Maya walked into Mrs. Henderson's English class, she felt like she was walking into a storm cloud. Maya had hoped that her first day was just bad luck, but now she knew it wasn't. Mrs. Henderson treated her differently than the other students, and it was becoming more obvious every single day. Maya started to dread third-period English class, and her stomach would hurt every morning when she thought about it. The pattern was always the same. When Maya raised her hand to answer questions, Mrs. Henderson would look right through her like she was invisible. When Maya tried to join class discussions, the teacher would cut her off in the middle of her sentences. Sometimes Mrs. Henderson would say, "Speak up, I can't hear you," even when Maya was talking in a normal voice and everyone else could hear her just fine. One day, Mrs. Henderson gave the class their first big writing assignment. They had to write an essay about what they did during summer vacation. Maya was excited because she loved writing, and she had many interesting things to write about. Her family had visited her grandmother in Atlanta, and they had gone to the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site. Maya wrote a beautiful essay about learning history and feeling inspired. Maya worked hard on her essay. She checked her spelling 3 times and made sure all her sentences were complete. She wrote about how visiting the historic site made her feel proud of her heritage and excited about making a difference in the world. She thought it was some of her best writing ever. When Mrs. Henderson handed back the essays a week later, Maya was shocked. Her paper had a big red C written on the top. There were comments all over her essay questioning whether she had gotten help from someone else. Mrs. Henderson had written things like, "This seems too advanced for your level," and "Did you copy this from somewhere?" Maya felt tears coming to her eyes, but she didn't want to cry in front of the class. She looked around at other students' papers and saw that they got much better grades. Jake, who sat in front of her, got a B+, even though Maya could see spelling mistakes all over his paper. Sarah got an A on an essay that was much shorter than Maya's and didn't have nearly as many interesting details. After class, Maya stayed behind to talk to Mrs. Henderson about her grade. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm confused about my grade," Maya said politely. "I worked really hard on this essay and I didn't get any help from anyone. These are all my own words and ideas." Mrs. Henderson barely looked up from her desk. "Maya, I have to grade based on what I believe each student is capable of. Perhaps you should focus on simpler topics that are more appropriate for your background." Maya didn't understand what Mrs. Henderson meant by appropriate for your background, but it made her feel bad inside. She walked out of the classroom, feeling confused and hurt. The next week brought a group project about famous American authors. Mrs. Henderson divided the class into groups of 4 students each. Maya was put in a group with Jessica, Connor, and a quiet boy named David. Maya was happy to be with Jessica, who had been kind to her since the first day. Maya's group decided to research Maya Angelou, the famous writer and poet. Maya was excited because she had read some of Maya Angelou's books and knew a lot about her life story. She volunteered to research the author's childhood and early life. Maya spent hours at the library and at home researching Maya Angelou. She found interesting facts about how the author overcame many challenges to become successful. She prepared note cards and practiced her part of the presentation many times. When it was time for Maya's group to present, everything started well. Jessica talked about Maya Angelou's most famous books, and Connor discussed her poetry. It was Maya's turn to talk about the author's early life. She began speaking confidently about the challenges Maya Angelou faced as a child. But Mrs. Henderson kept interrupting her. "Where did you find that information, Maya?" the teacher asked. "Are you sure that source is reliable?" Maya had gotten her information from the same library books and websites that other students used for their projects, but Mrs. Henderson kept questioning her sources. She demanded that Maya provide more citations, even though other groups hadn't been asked to do this. When Maya talked about how Maya Angelou overcame racism and discrimination, Mrs. Henderson frowned and said, "I think you're showing a concerning bias towards certain perspectives. Try to be more objective in your analysis." Maya felt embarrassed and confused. She wasn't being biased. She was just sharing historical facts about Maya Angelou's life. But Mrs. Henderson made it sound like Maya was doing something wrong. Jessica noticed what was happening and tried to help. "Mrs. Henderson, Maya's research is really good. She found information that the rest of us didn't know about." Mrs. Henderson's face turned red with anger. "Miss Williams, I don't recall asking for your opinion about my teaching methods. Please focus on your own presentation." Jessica looked shocked and hurt. She had only been trying to stand up for her friend. Maya felt terrible that Jessica was getting in trouble because of her. The worst incident happened during a vocabulary quiz. Maya had studied all the words very carefully. She made flashcards and practiced with her mom the night before. When she took the quiz, she was confident that she knew all the answers. But when Mrs. Henderson handed back the graded quizzes, Maya couldn't believe what she saw. There was a big red F on the top of her paper. Maya looked at her answers and saw that Mrs. Henderson had marked many correct answers as wrong. Words that Maya knew she had defined correctly were marked with big red X's. At the top of the paper, Mrs. Henderson had written, "See me after class," in angry red letters. When all the other students left, Maya walked up to Mrs. Henderson's desk. With her quiz, her hands were shaking a little because she was nervous, but she knew she had to speak up. "Mrs. Henderson, I think there might be some mistakes on my quiz," Maya said quietly. "These answers are correct. I checked them in the textbook." Mrs. Henderson looked up from her gradebook with cold, angry eyes. "Are you questioning my grading abilities, Maya? Perhaps the problem isn't with my grading. Perhaps the problem is with your understanding of the material." She leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was quiet, but mean. "Maybe you would be more comfortable in a different class, one that's more suited to your background." Maya felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She knew now that Mrs. Henderson's treatment had nothing to do with her schoolwork or her behavior. It had everything to do with who she was and what she looked like. Maya picked up her quiz and walked out of the classroom. She held back her tears until she got to the bathroom, where she finally let them fall. She didn't understand why this was happening to her, but she knew she couldn't keep letting it happen without doing something about it. Maya had been keeping her problems with Mrs. Henderson a secret for almost 2 months. Every day after school, her mother would ask how her day went, and Maya would just say, "Fine," or "Okay." She didn't want to worry her parents, and she especially didn't want to run to her father for help. Maya wanted to prove that she could handle her own problems, but the stress was starting to show. Maya wasn't sleeping well at night because she would lie in bed thinking about English class. She wasn't eating much at lunch because her stomach always hurt. Her grades in other classes were starting to drop because she couldn't concentrate on her homework. Maya's mother, Linda Johnson, began to notice changes in her daughter. Maya used to be cheerful and talkative at dinner, but now she was quiet and picked at her food. She used to love reading books in her free time, but now she just sat in her room staring out the window. One evening, Linda sat down on Maya's bed and asked gently, "Honey, is everything okay at school? You seem sad lately." Maya wanted to tell her mother everything, but she was afraid. What if her parents got involved and made things worse? What if Mrs. Henderson found out that Maya's father was the principal and became even meaner? "I'm just tired, Mom," Maya said. "The new school is different from my old one. I'm still getting used to it." Linda wasn't convinced, but she didn't want to push too hard. She hugged Maya and told her she could talk to her about anything, anytime. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson was getting bolder with her unfair treatment. She seemed to think that no one would stop her, so she didn't even try to hide her behavior anymore. During a school assembly about diversity and inclusion, Mrs. Henderson sat with the other teachers but kept making comments under her breath. Maya was sitting with her class when she heard Mrs. Henderson talking to the teacher next to her. The assembly speaker was talking about treating all students fairly and creating a welcoming environment for everyone. "Some of these students need to learn to adapt to our standards instead of expecting us to lower our expectations," Mrs. Henderson said, not bothering to whisper quietly. Maya felt her face get hot with embarrassment. Other students around her heard the comment too, and some of them looked uncomfortable. Jessica, who was sitting next to Maya, reached over and squeezed her hand to show support. After the assembly, Maya's friend Marcus, who was also one of the few black students in the school, came up to her in the hallway. "Did you hear what Mrs. Henderson said during the assembly?" Marcus asked. "That was messed up. She was obviously talking about us." Maya nodded sadly. "She does stuff like that in English class all the time. She treats me differently than the other students." Marcus looked angry. "You should tell someone about this. That's not right." But Maya still wasn't ready to get adults involved. She was hoping things would get better on their own. Things got much worse during parent-teacher conferences. Maya's mother came to meet with all of Maya's teachers to see how she was doing in her classes. Linda Johnson introduced herself to each teacher as Mrs. Johnson, without mentioning that her husband was the principal. She wanted to get honest feedback about Maya's performance. Maya's other teachers had wonderful things to say. Her math teacher said Maya was one of his best students. Her science teacher praised Maya's curiosity and participation in class. Her history teacher said Maya's essays were thoughtful and well-written. But when Linda sat down with Mrs. Henderson, the conversation was completely different. "I have some concerns about Maya," Mrs. Henderson said before Linda could even ask any questions. "She seems to have some attitude problems that are affecting her performance in my class." Linda was surprised. This didn't sound like her daughter at all. "What kind of attitude problems?" she asked. "Well, she often questions my grading and seems to think she knows better than I do," Mrs. Henderson said. "And she has difficulty following directions. I'm not sure she's prepared for the academic rigor of our school." Mrs. Henderson pulled out Maya's grade book and showed Linda the poor grades. "As you can see, Maya is struggling significantly in English. I think she might benefit from remedial classes or perhaps a different school environment altogether." Linda looked at the grades with shock. Maya had always been an excellent student, especially in English. Something didn't add up. "Can I see some examples of Maya's work?" Linda asked. "I'd like to understand where she's having difficulties." Mrs. Henderson became defensive. "I'm afraid I can't share other students' work due to privacy concerns, but trust me, Maya's work is below the standard I expect from 7th grade students." Linda left the meeting feeling confused and worried. The Maya that Mrs. Henderson described didn't sound like her daughter at all. When she got home, she sat Maya down for a serious conversation. "Maya, I just met with Mrs. Henderson, and she had some concerning things to say about your behavior and grades in English class. Can you tell me what's really going on?" Maya looked at her mother's worried face and finally broke down. All the feelings she had been holding inside for months came pouring out in tears and words. "Mom, she hates me," Maya cried. "She treats me differently than everyone else. She ignores me when I raise my hand, She grades my work unfairly, and she makes mean comments about me in front of the other students. Linda held her daughter while Maya told her everything. She described the unfair quiz grades, the biased comments during presentations, and the way Mrs. Henderson made her feel unwelcome every single day. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner, sweetheart?" Linda asked gently. "I didn't want Dad to get involved because he's the principal," Maya sobbed. "I thought if Mrs. Henderson found out, she would treat me even worse, and I wanted to handle it myself." Linda felt her heart breaking for her daughter and anger building toward Mrs. Henderson. No child should have to endure months of discrimination and harassment at school. That evening, Linda told her husband everything. Principal Johnson listened with growing horror as he realized that his own daughter had been suffering under his watch, without him knowing. "I should have noticed something was wrong," he said, feeling guilty. "I should have been paying more attention." "We both should have," Linda replied. "But now we know, and we need to do something about it." Unknown to the Johnson family, other parents were starting to notice problems too. Jessica's mother had called the school to express concerns about what her daughter was witnessing in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. 2 other parents of minority students had submitted complaints about discriminatory treatment. Mrs. Henderson had no idea that her behavior was being noticed and documented by so many people. She continued treating Maya and other students unfairly, thinking that her years of experience and reputation would protect her from any consequences. But the truth was finally coming out, and Mrs. Henderson's world was about to change forever. Principal Johnson couldn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about everything Maya had told them about Mrs. Henderson. As a father, he wanted to march into that classroom and protect his daughter immediately. But as the school principal, he knew he had to handle this situation carefully and professionally. The next morning, Principal Johnson arrived at school early and went straight to his office. He pulled out Mrs. Henderson's file and started reading through her employment history. What he found made his stomach turn. There were several complaints from previous years about Mrs. Henderson's treatment of minority students, but they had all been dismissed or ignored by the former principal. Principal Johnson realized that this problem was much bigger than just Maya. Mrs. Henderson had been discriminating against students for years, and no one had stopped her. He felt angry at himself for not catching this sooner, but he was determined to fix it now. He called his assistant and asked her to schedule meetings with all the parents who had complained about Mrs. Henderson. He also requested copies of grade distributions from her classes over the past 3 years. When the numbers came back, they told a clear story. Students of color consistently received lower grades in Mrs. Henderson's classes, even when their test scores and work in other subjects were excellent. Principal Johnson knew he needed more evidence before he could take action. He contacted the School District's central office and requested an independent classroom observer. This was a retired teacher named Mrs. Patricia Williams, who specialized in identifying bias and discrimination in educational settings. "I need someone to observe Mrs. Henderson's classes without her knowing why," Principal Johnson explained to Mrs. Williams. "I want objective documentation of what's happening in that classroom." Mrs. Williams agreed to help. She would pose as a general classroom observer doing routine evaluations. Mrs. Henderson would think it was just a normal part of the school's evaluation process. Meanwhile, Maya was still going to English class every day, even though it was becoming harder and harder. The stress was affecting her appetite, her sleep, and her ability to focus in other classes. But she didn't want to give Mrs. Henderson the satisfaction of seeing her give up. Maya's friends had started to rally around her. Jessica began keeping a notebook where she wrote down every unfair thing Mrs. Henderson did to Maya. Marcus started sitting closer to Maya in class so he could be a witness to the discrimination. Even some of the white students in the class were beginning to notice that something was wrong. During this time, Mrs. Henderson seemed to get even worse. Maybe she sensed that people were watching her, or maybe she was just becoming more confident in her behavior. Either way, she started being even more obvious about treating Maya unfairly. Mrs. Williams, the independent observer, spent a full week in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. She sat in the back corner with a clipboard, pretending to evaluate general teaching methods. But what she was really doing was documenting every interaction between Mrs. Henderson and her students. What Mrs. Williams saw shocked her. In her 30 years of education, she had never seen such clear and obvious discrimination. Mrs. Henderson consistently ignored Maya when she raised her hand. She interrupted Maya more than any other student. She questioned Maya's answers even when they were correct. And she made subtle but hurtful comments about Maya's work and participation. Mrs. Williams wrote everything down in detail. She noted the time, the context, and the exact words that were said. She also observed how Mrs. Henderson treated other students differently, giving white students more attention, patience, and encouragement. The breaking point came on Friday of that week during a lesson about civil rights literature. Mrs. Henderson had assigned the class to write essays about overcoming adversity. Maya wrote a powerful and personal essay about facing discrimination in school and how it made her stronger and more determined to succeed. When Maya read her essay aloud to the class, several students were moved by her words. Jessica had tears in her eyes, and even some of the boys looked impressed by Maya's courage and writing ability. But Mrs. Henderson's reaction was completely different. She frowned and shook her head as Maya read. "Maya, this essay is inappropriate for this assignment," Mrs. Henderson said after Maya finished reading. "You're being too political and making everything about race instead of focusing on the actual literary themes we're studying." Maya felt her face burn with embarrassment. "But Mrs. Henderson, the assignment was to write about overcoming adversity. That's what I wrote about." "Don't argue with me," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "This kind of writing shows that you're not mature enough to handle academic criticism. You're failing to understand the difference between personal complaints and literary analysis." She held up Maya's essay for the whole class to see. "This is an example of how some students try to make everything about race instead of doing the actual academic work. I'm giving this essay an F." The classroom was completely silent. Several students looked shocked and uncomfortable. Two students, Jessica and a boy named Tommy, actually stood up and walked out of the classroom in protest. Mrs. Williams, the observer, was writing furiously in her notebook. She had never seen such a clear example of discriminatory treatment in all her years of education. Mrs. Henderson had just publicly humiliated a student for writing about her own experiences with discrimination. After class, Maya sat at her desk, trying not to cry. She had put her heart into that essay, and Mrs. Henderson had torn it apart in front of everyone. Maya felt like giving up on school altogether. But Jessica came back into the classroom after the bell rang. "Maya, that was the best essay I've ever heard," she said. "Mrs. Henderson is wrong and everyone knows it. Don't let her make you think you're not smart." That afternoon, Mrs. Williams went straight to Principal Johnson's office with her report. Her face was serious, and her voice was angry. "Mr. Johnson, what I witnessed in that classroom this week is the worst case of educational discrimination I have seen in my career," she said. "Mrs. Henderson's treatment of Maya and other minority students is not just unfair, it's harmful, and possibly illegal." She handed him her detailed report, which documented dozens of incidents of biased treatment over just 5 days. "This teacher should not be in a classroom," Mrs. Williams concluded. "She is damaging these children and it needs to stop immediately." Principal Johnson read through the report with growing anger and sadness. The woman who had been torturing his daughter for months was finally going to face consequences for her actions. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Henderson's extension. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to see you in my office first thing Monday morning. We have some important matters to discuss." Mrs. Henderson agreed, having no idea that her career was about to end, and that the student she had been targeting was about to be revealed as the principal's own daughter. Monday morning came with gray clouds and a feeling of tension in the air. Mrs. Henderson walked into Lincoln Middle School like she had done thousands of times before. She carried her coffee cup and her lesson plans, thinking about the week ahead. She had no idea that this would be her last normal morning at the school. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, Mrs. Henderson knocked on Principal Johnson's office door. She had been curious about why he wanted to meet with her, but she wasn't worried. In her mind, she was a good teacher who had never done anything wrong. "Come in, Mrs. Henderson," Principal Johnson called from inside his office. Mrs. Henderson entered with a confident smile. She had been teaching for 25 years and had never been in serious trouble. She expected this to be a routine meeting about curriculum or upcoming school events. Principal Johnson was sitting behind his desk with several folders in front of him. His face was serious, but Mrs. Henderson didn't notice. She sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited for him to speak. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to discuss some very serious concerns that have been brought to my attention about your classroom conduct," Principal Johnson began. His voice was calm but firm. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" Principal Johnson opened the first folder and pulled out Mrs. Williams's detailed report. "An independent observer spent a week in your classroom last week. Her findings are very troubling." He began reading from the report, describing incident after incident of discriminatory behavior. He talked about how Mrs. Henderson ignored Maya's raised hand, questioned her correct answers, and made unfair comments about her work. Mrs. Henderson's confident expression slowly changed to confusion and then to defensive anger. "These are ridiculous accusations," she said, her voice getting louder. "I treat all my students fairly. If certain students are having problems, maybe they need to look at their own attitudes and preparation." Principal Johnson continued calmly. He showed her the grade analysis that proved minority students consistently received lower marks in her classes. He presented the parent complaints that had been filed over the past month. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "This is all nonsense," Mrs. Henderson protested. "Some students just can't handle high academic standards. I refuse to lower my expectations just to make people feel better." Principal Johnson then pulled out his phone and showed Mrs. Henderson something that made her face turn pale. It was a recording from the classroom security camera that captured her humiliating Maya about the essay on Friday. Mrs. Henderson watched herself on the small screen, seeing how cruel and unfair she had been. She watched herself dismiss Maya's thoughtful essay and make hurtful comments in front of the entire class. The evidence was right there in front of her, and she couldn't deny it anymore. I was just trying to maintain academic standards," she stammered. But her voice was weak and uncertain now. Principal Johnson leaned forward and looked directly into Mrs. Henderson's eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to understand something very important. The student you have been targeting and discriminating against for the past 3 months is my daughter. Maya Johnson is my daughter." The words hit Mrs. Henderson like a bolt of lightning. Her mouth fell open and her face went completely white. She sat in shocked silence, realizing that she had been bullying the principal's own child for months. Your daughter?" she whispered. "Yes, my daughter," Principal Johnson said, his professional mask slipping slightly. "But even if she wasn't my daughter, your behavior would still be completely unacceptable. You have violated every principle of fair and equal education that this school stands for." Mrs. Henderson tried to speak, but no words came out. She realized that her career was over and that everyone would know what she had done. All her years of experience and her reputation meant nothing now. I didn't know," she finally managed to say. "It doesn't matter that you didn't know," Principal Johnson replied firmly. "Your treatment of Maya and other minority students has been wrong regardless of who their parents are. Every child deserves to be treated with respect and fairness." Mrs. Henderson began to panic. "Please, Mr. Johnson, I can change. I can do better. I've been teaching here for 25 years. This school is my life." But Principal Johnson had already made his decision. "Mrs. Henderson, your employment at Lincoln Middle School is terminated effective immediately. You will be escorted from the building today, and this matter will be reported to the school board and the state education department." 2 days later, the school held a packed board meeting. Parents, students, and community members filled the auditorium to hear about what had happened. Maya, supported by her family and friends, bravely stood up and told her story to the crowd. "For 3 months I dreaded going to English class," Maya said, her voice clear and strong. "Mrs. Henderson made me feel like I didn't belong, like I wasn't smart enough, like I was somehow less than the other students. No student should ever have to feel that way at school." The audience listened in silence as Maya described the unfair, grading, the public humiliation, and the hurtful comments. When she finished speaking, many people had tears in their eyes, and the auditorium erupted in supportive applause. Jessica also spoke at the meeting, telling everyone about what she had witnessed in the classroom. "Maya is one of the smartest and kindest people I know," Jessica said. "Mrs. Henderson treated her terribly, and it wasn't fair. I'm proud to be Maya's friend, and I'm glad she finally got justice." The school board voted unanimously to terminate Mrs. Henderson's employment and to implement new policies to prevent discrimination. They also voted to provide additional training for all teachers about bias and fair treatment of students. In the weeks that followed, Maya began to heal from her painful experience. She started to love learning again and felt comfortable participating in all her classes. Her grades improved, and she made many new friends who admired her courage. Maya also became an advocate for other students who faced discrimination. She worked with her father to create a student support system where kids could report unfair treatment safely and confidentially. Mrs. Henderson never taught again. Her teaching license was suspended, and her reputation in the education community was destroyed. She had to find a completely different career, and she would always be remembered as the teacher who lost everything because of her prejudice and cruelty. Maya's story became an inspiration to students throughout the district. She showed everyone that standing up to discrimination, even when it's scary and difficult, can lead to positive change. Her courage helped make Lincoln Middle School a better and fairer place for all students. The experience taught Maya that her voice mattered and that she had the power to fight injustice. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.